I think we'll never know why Bach at the end of his life put together the piece which we now know as the B minor Mass. And the reason we'll never know is that for Bach in his lifetime, there was absolutely no need for a huge piece like this because there was no chance ever of a performance. And perhaps in a way we can tell that because the piece is a giant to perform and needs huge amount of stamina. And the idea of performing a mass in a concert was not around until Beethoven wrote his Missa Solemnis. So there must be other reasons why Bach put together all of these pieces. And I reckon it's because he wanted to show us a compendium of all the sorts of choral music he could write. If we think about his output, there are lots of pieces that are compendia of what he could do. The 48 preludes and fugues, for example, which show us what you can do in all the different keys. And then there's the art of the fugue, which tells you all you can do with a fugue subject. And then the Goldberg variations, everything you can do with a variation technique. And so the B minor Mass, as we have it, is a compendium of his choral output. Now, two of the pieces had already been composed. Back in 1733, he wrote a Missa Brevis, and a Missa Brevis was something that was allowed in the Lutheran Church, where you set the Kyrie, which of course is Greek, and the Gloria in Latin, and you could use it on festival days. And Bach wrote 4 other Missa Brevises, and the B minor one was written in 1733 because Augustus II of Poland had died. There was a long period of mourning, and that's when Bach wrote this Mass. And he'd anticipated that perhaps it would be performed when Augustus III was crowned, and Augustus, by chance, was also the Elector of Saxony. And what Bach was doing there was to write a Missa Brevis, submitting the manuscript with a letter that said, "I'd like an appointment in your court." And for a long time, poor old Bach didn't get that appointment, although eventually he was made a court composer in Saxony under Augustus III. So he got there in the end. So that 1733 Mass already existed, and we know that the Sanctus was written and performed in 1724 on Christmas Day. And again, on a Christmas Day, you could have little bits of Latin in the Lutheran Mass. What is the puzzle is why he should want to set the whole of the Creed, which is something that would never have been sung in the Lutheran Church service. And then, of course, he puts together, after the Sanctus, the Benedictus and the Agnus Dei to complete this High Mass. And it was never performed in his lifetime. Soon after he died, his son C.P. Bach brought out the Credo movements, and those were performed in C.P. Bach's day. And then we know that at the beginning of the 19th century, people began to bring out the manuscripts. It was then published, and it's about the 1850s when a first performance of the B minor Mass as we know it was performed complete. In this country, it didn't reach this country until 1900. So as I say, it's a compendium of the choral works that Bach wanted to show that he could write, and quite a few of the movements are taken from other works by him. I don't suppose Bach was showing off really, but he does show us all sorts of different ways of writing in this piece. The opening chorus is one of the longest fugues Bach ever wrote, and so it's a very stately opening to the piece. And then the second Kyrie is written in a stile antico, an antiquated style, and that again was deliberate, partly because that piece was written for the Emperor Augustus, and in the court I think Bach thought that the old-fashioned style of writing was rather a good one. Once we introduce trumpets and drums, of course, we go into D major, and most of this piece, in fact, is in D major. And so the Gloria starts off with those trumpets and drums making a wonderful statement. And a chorus like the opening Gloria is very instrumental in its writing. You almost feel as though Bach is expecting his voices to be instruments. Later on in the Credo, there's an extraordinary moment when the first section is written completely in plain song. Now I mean by that the intonation of the Credo, Credo in unum Deum, is the tune that the tenors sing when they first come in, and all the material is built around that plain song. Now of course plain song in the Lutheran Church was not there at all. So this is quite something for Bach to be making that point, that he understands that church music comes from the plain song of the past and from the Italian church and the Roman church. And then he quotes plain song again in the Confiteor movement, which is the last movement of that credo section. And that plain song comes out of the texture. The piece is already a double fugue with two subjects, and then the tenors, the basses and the altos sing the plain song in long notes. And in my performance, and perhaps in many people's performance, we bring those out of the texture by singing them a little more loudly. And I've said that some of the movements were borrowed. The chorus movements, some of them were from cantatas he'd already written. The Crucifixus is the earliest piece we think he'd ever written and put in this piece, and was written in 1714. And when we say borrowed, we sometimes mean, as in the Crucifixus, that he has just transposed it and rewritten it. Sometimes we mean that he takes a movement he's already rewritten and rewrites it completely. It's what you call a parody of the music already written. And that Crucifixus is interesting because he does transpose it from F minor into E minor for the B minor Mass, puts the new words to it. And then when he gets to the end, he decides he wants 5 or 6 extra bars. And because he's not spaced his manuscript properly, he has to write the ledger lines, or the lines at the side, the staves at the side, to write that coda on. The Agnus Dei, we know, comes from a cantata, in fact a secular cantata, and we know that Bach rewrote that tune, that melody, at least twice before rewriting it yet again for the B minor Mass. And also we know that the Hosanna, which is a double chorus, so the first time that 2 lots of soprano, alto, tenor and bass sing together, is also from a secular cantata. And my feeling is when we sing the end of the Creed and we sing all those fanfares that sound like a hunting chorus, that perhaps that's another example of a secular piece turned into a religious piece by Bach for this B minor Mass. And the arias that go between these choruses also are quite remarkable in Bach's output. As we say, we know some of them were rewritten from other pieces, but all of them are through composed. And what I mean by that is they are not da capo arias. And that was the convention of this time in opera, and indeed, if you listen to the Matthew Passion, most of the arias follow an ABA structure where you repeat the first section after a middle section. None of them in the B minor Mass do that. And I suppose we should remark too on the scoring of some of these, particularly the bass aria at the end of the Gloria, which is scored for bassoons and the bass voice and a solo horn. And that's the most remarkable sound world that Bach conjures up there. And then perhaps one final thing to say about it is the wonderful way Bach creates structure. Although we said he was putting this piece together from different bits of his output, he still has in mind the architecture of them. And that's particularly noticeable in the Creed setting, which is in a certain number of movements with a central section, and that central section is the Crucifixus. And so there's an overarching feel to that. And then one final bit of structure is that the movement at the beginning, the Gratias, which is also in an old-fashioned style, he brings that back for the Dona Nobis Pacem at the end. And so as we arrive at the end of the Mass, we do feel that we are hearing music we heard before, and we feel a wonderful sense of completeness. So here we have a towering masterpiece, one of the hardest pieces to bring off. Very hard for the chorus, because I think I've said that we need lots of stamina, but also there are dickens of a number of notes in it, so we need lots of concentration and lots of rehearsal time. But of course the point is that it is all well worth it. Bach's writing is just supreme, and not only is it supreme, it's carrying you to a different level. He always said to the glory of God at the end of his manuscripts, and you can tell that this piece was written very much to the glory of God.